I want to start with a disclaimer, because I think this video could be easily misunderstood or misconstrued to say something that I'm not necessarily saying. What I'm not saying is that there is never a good reason to apologize for something that occurred in the past, or even why someone might stand in as a proxy to offer an apology to perhaps a victim or someone. What I am saying is that there are good reasons not to do that, and we are very quick to dismiss or not consider what those reasons are. So I want to offer some considerations about why that often doesn't help and why it's logically and morally wrong in some cases to apologize for crimes that have committed in the past, or to demand apologies from people who are alive today who had nothing to do with those crimes but are found guilty by association of some shared trait that they possess with those who committed those crimes. I grew up on a street called Lancaster Crescent, which was actually a really fun place to grow up, but there was a moment in the history of that neighborhood that shocked and rocked the peace and solidarity of that neighborhood, because there was a family that lived a little ways up the street from where I grew up that was a blended family. And what we came to learn is that that blending of that family didn't seem to be a terrible success, because at one point when that family went away on vacation, the teenage son murdered his parents and his siblings and step-siblings. And I believe he killed himself in the process. And what made that so unspeakably tragic, in addition to the fact of just the crime itself, was that there was no way to find resolution or closure. There was no way to get your questions answered to try and make sense of this tragedy. But imagine if within that frustration and this deep desire for resolution, someone decided that the people of Lancaster Crescent were going to have to serve some kind of penitential punishment for the crimes of that kid. Imagine if everyone else, including members of the legal system and the government, insisted that residents of Lancaster Crescent all be dragged out into a media spotlight to give an account for their complicit guilt in this particular crime. Or imagine if one resident of Lancaster Crescent went and did a media interview with tissue boxes in front of them and earnestly apologized on behalf of the people of Lancaster Crescent for this horrible crime. Wouldn't most of us look at a gesture like that and think, this just looks like someone trying to narcissistically gain the spotlight? And even if it isn't that, it seems like it would only be an unhelpful exacerbation of the tragedy and the confusion, and would prolong that confusion and pain while simultaneously preventing the arrival of peace and closure. I would like to think that anybody with a shred of moral awareness would be able to see that this would be an instance of misplaced blame based on an association that has nothing to do with the crime. This would be like a case of correlation that is unrelated to causation. The simple fact is, none of the other residents of that neighborhood had any guilt to share by virtue of the fact that they happen to live in that neighborhood. I think that in a lot of cases where people who are alive today are expected to make amends or apologize for crimes that occurred in the past, based on some shared trait or association with the long since departed criminals, something like that is going on. A really regrettable example of this is by looking at something like slavery, which few people seem to realize was practiced universally in every culture prior to the coming of Christendom. But we look at something like slavery and we say that because in recent memory certain groups with certain skin colors practiced slavery, people with those same traits, in this case skin color, because they share that trait, they should also share in the blame of that crime. Or we might expect people from a certain country to feel guilt by association for the things that occurred in that country from generations ago. We expect people who, by sheer accident of their conception, ended up in a particular location to feel guilty for things that happened in that location from long ago. It would be much more sensible to blame the people of Lancaster Crescent for the death of that family than these other examples. At least in that case, they were alive when it occurred. In the other examples, they were separated by not only direct involvement with the crime, but by time itself. The only way that we can cast that kind of blame on someone is by finding a correlation that is far more consequential than something like you happen to live in the same place that they used to live in, or you kind of look like them. For an example that hits closer to home, I'm Catholic, and in the world's largest religion, you don't have to look very far to find examples of Catholics behaving really badly. But it's become common practice to associate all of Catholicism with that behavior. But rarely will you find accusers of Catholics who are able to connect the bad things that some Catholics have done to the teachings, beliefs, and creed of Catholicism, which is the burden of proof you would have to satisfy before accusing other Catholics of being guilty by association. But there are creeds that perpetuate the evil of their adherents. For example, the millions of people that died under fascist and communist rule in the 20th century are a direct result of those philosophies. It's not incidental. They are both inherently violently oriented. They call for violence against anyone who is deemed to be an enemy of the people. Which is why it would be then logical to insist that anybody who continues to perpetuate those philosophies be made to admit that the evils that occurred are a result of those philosophies, and then repent for having admired or promoted them. But in the cases where people expect people who are alive today to apologize for things that happened in the past because of some loose association, like you happen to live in the same place that they lived, or you happen to have the same skin color as them, that burden of proof is rarely addressed, which is how we can know that what we're actually doing when we do that is scapegoating innocent people in order to satiate our appetite for revenge. But even if we do rise to the challenge of that burden of proof, there is another serious impediment to doing so fairly and justly, and that is our lack of appreciation for what it was like to live in the past. For example, we often judge the harshness that was prominent in past generations, and we are quick to judge that harshness as abuse. And if we treated each other today, and especially children, the way that they did so in the past, it would probably be accurate to call it abuse. But what that fails to appreciate is that the lives of many of us today are quite a bit more carefree, and that's an understatement, than those of our ancestors. We don't have to be nearly as vigilant as them because we aren't susceptible to the same vulnerabilities as they were. Their brand of discipline was often harsh because they lived a harsh existence. They couldn't afford to be as carefree as we are today because the stakes were too high. If they were undisciplined, lazy, self-entitled, or they didn't apply themselves to learn what they needed to learn, the consequences could be extremely severe. For example, if you were a farmer back then and you didn't live in a disciplined and regimented way, your crops could potentially fail, your livestock could die off, and then you could be facing the prospects of starvation. You had to be virtuous and disciplined just to survive. And if starvation wasn't a threat, illness, injury, infection, wild animals, or just exposure to the elements could all dramatically affect or claim your well-being or the livelihood or well-being of those you love. And the thing about children is that they tend to act in a carefree way until it's too late, which is why their parents, teachers, elders, and superiors might discipline them in a way that we would call excessive, but that's because the consequences of their time were what we might call excessive. Like, it would be better to get the strap for playing near or in an abandoned coal mine and live to tell the story than to be disciplined in a way that is fairly inconsequential and doesn't discourage you from going back there and playing again, only to be buried alive and to lose your life. Another problem with judging people or circumstances from the past is that our judgments ought to be based on evidence, and evidence of the past as time goes on is harder to interpret. For example, there would be no living eyewitnesses, what we might call direct evidence, and there might not be any more physical or forensic evidence, what we would call circumstantial evidence, because it's deteriorated over time. This is why many legal systems impose a concept called a statute of limitations, which is a concession that after a certain amount of time, it's far too difficult to prove something occurred the way we think it occurred beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard of proof that we need in order to convict somebody of a crime. This is also what makes it extremely easy for someone to selectively gather information about a past incident and frame it pretty much however they want. In political debate, this is why it's so easy to cast an ideology, religion, or culture in a really bad light. And if the media or people in positions of power make those kinds of accusations, most people aren't going to take the time to really investigate it and think critically about it, so they'll likely just accept them with very little skepticism. And that is how easy it is to fall into a scenario where we first not only scapegoat somebody, but then punish them unjustly. So the next time a person or group is expected to make amends for some crime by correlation, and you are tempted to join the chorus of the mob demanding that repentance, make sure that that guilt by association is much stronger than a mere correlation. And I think we need to be much more understanding of someone who refuses to apologize for a crime they didn't commit. That takes a lot of courage to first stand up against the mob. And second of all, that person is showing us what true justice looks like. That person is an actual beacon of justice, and we should probably tune in and listen to what they have to say. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to like and subscribe for more. And if you want to support the making of content like this, then please consider joining my online community, The Reinforcements. It's kind of like Patreon, but instead of being beholden to a big tech company, it's a website I built entirely myself, so there's no risk of us being censored or shut down or anything like that. There are hundreds of people who have already signed up, and our mission is to renew and reinforce the church. So if that's you, then come check it out. As an added bonus for certain tiers, I will also send you a gift box from Glory and Shine, which is a Catholic, family-owned and operated company. They make bath and body products. They're actually their beard balm I'm supporting, or I'm sporting right now. I'm not just a spokesperson, I'm actually a customer. So even if you don't join the Reinforcements, maybe check them out anyways. Glory and Shine, they're an amazing company.